Not surprisingly, given such a sprawling and multicultural nation and the 235-year history of the United States Congress, there have been a few eccentrics. But perhaps none was more so than a 1920s Oklahoma congressman whom Washington Post columnist John Kelly called one of the oddest ducks ever to paddle in a Capitol's pond. If for no other reason than he might well have been the most eccentric congressman in history, Oklahoma's Manuel Herrick, the Okie Jesus Congressman, deserves to be remembered. The United States election of 1920 was certainly going to be one for the history books. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified in August, making the election of 1920 the first nationwide election in which women had an equal right to vote. But it was also a dynamic time in American politics. President Woodrow Wilson, who had won the vote in 1912 and again in 1916, was losing popularity after the end of the First World War. Wilson's own ambition to be nominated again in 1920 had prevented some of the more popular members of his party from actively campaigning, and relatively unknown Ohio Governor James Cox had required 44 ballots before finally being nominated at the convention. On the Republican side, the split that had crippled the party in 1912 had largely been healed, and Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding had been nominated on a ticket of return to normalcy. In Oklahoma, 42-year-old Manuel Herrick had filed to run in the Republican primary in Oklahoma's 8th Congressional District. Comprising much of north-central Oklahoma, the 8th District was Oklahoma's wealthiest district and solidly Republican. The candidacy of Mr. Herrick wasn't taken seriously. The district was represented by popular five-term Congressman Dick Thompson Morgan. Known affectionately as Uncle Dick, Morgan was considered such a shoo-in that no serious Republican candidate had chosen to file against him. And the Democrat, C.H. Hyde, was considered, the newspaper the Perry Republican wrote, a ticket filler with no hopes of election. Morgan seemed destined to win re-election easily in a year in which the Republican Party was on the rise. In July of 1920, the 67-year-old Morgan was traveling from Washington back to Oklahoma to campaign when he fell ill, having contracted pneumonia. He died on July 4th. It was not only coincidentally the nation's Independence Day, it was also, it turns out, 2 days after the Oklahoma filing deadline for the 1920 election. The Perry Republican reported, "An embarrassing condition is wrought by the death of our congressman, Dick T. Morgan. Manuel Herrick of our county, who ran independently 2 years ago, has filed as a Republican. C.H. Hyde, a Democrat from the west side of the district, is the Democratic candidate without opposition. The election of a member of Congress means something. We can hardly comprehend the situation that confronts us." The paper described Hyde as, for the past several years, an office holder of the penny ante type under the state Democratic administration, and Herrick as a candidate with ideas, wild and romantic. Showing its party bent, the paper opined, "We hope the Republicans of the county and district will withhold their opinion until they are informed on the conditions of the most peculiar circumstances that have ever confronted the county, district, or state at large." Not surprisingly, there were many who did not favor those conditions. Winfield Scott, a lieutenant colonel in the Army, chairman of the Garfield County Republican Party and former county judge who had been elected mayor of Enid, Oklahoma in 1917 but had been unable to serve because he was called up for the Great War, decided to appeal to have his name placed on the Republican ballot. Claiming to run at the solicitation of many ex-servicemen, Scott appealed to the state election board to have his name replace Congressman Morgan. In the petition, Scott argued that your applicant respectfully represents that Manuel Herrick, who has filed application and whose name has been or will be printed on the ballot as a candidate for the Republican Party, is not a Republican in politics and has never been a Republican. At the last congressional election, said Manuel Herrick was a candidate as an independent. Said Manuel Herrick having been repeatedly a candidate for office as a Democrat, as a socialist, and as an independent, but never a Republican. W.C. McAllister, Secretary of the Election Board, however, declined Scott's petition, noting that the State Attorney General's office had ruled that registration as a member of a party is not necessary before a person may be a candidate in a primary of that party. The ruling was simple. Scott's complaint about Herrick was irrelevant. Scott had missed the filing deadline and would not be placed on the ballot. For his part, Herrick responded to Scott's claims, and in doing so, he demonstrated one of his many eccentricities. Herrick's grammar and spelling were idiosyncratic, including a tendency to randomly capitalize words. Yet whenever writing to newspapers, Herrick demanded that his words be printed as written or not at all, essentially preventing newspapers from correcting his grammar. In a letter, he answered, "To the libels of Winfield Scott of Enid. To his statements that I have repeatedly ran for office as a Democrat and Socialist, I wish to say that he knew that he was lying when he made said statements. And furthermore, I will withdraw from the ticket if it can be proven that my name ever appeared for any Democrat or Socialist ticket for any office in the state of Oklahoma. Herrick proclaimed that I am a calloused-handed farmer. Do not care who knows it. I'm not stealing a living or grafting it off of someone else. And that is what is hurting the silk-stocking crowd." But the issues with Herrick went beyond Scott's claim of party switching. When he ran to represent the district as an independent in 1918, Herrick had received just 56 votes. Herrick was not a typical politician, but rather a well-known eccentric. The Oklahoma City Daily Oklahoman explained, "The town of Perry has at first refused to take him seriously. People delight to tell of his eccentricities and of the practical jokes the boys of Perry have played upon him." This certainly showed in his style. The Oklahoman explained that long flowing hair and whiskers were features of Herrick's makeup until a few years ago. And as to clothing, his taste ran to hats of extravagant dimensions and to garments of unparliamentary cut. The Oklahoma City paper Harlow's Weekly wrote that if the voters of the 8th Congressional District were to see Manuel Herrick or hear him speak for 5 minutes or see his photo in the newspaper, they would overwhelmingly vote against him as a representative of our district. The paper described him as an agitator of the worst type, without a single constructive ideal. Certainly he did himself no favors in his campaign. The Oklahoman said of him, "His conversations may not have much mercy on the King's English, so far as conventional pronunciation is concerned, but it shows an acquaintance with terms of many syllables and imposing sound." In fact, it seemed that Republicans, still hoping to retain the district, hoped for a front porch campaign. As the Oklahoman explained, as soon as Herrick leaves his front porch, his campaign is blown up. To curb Herrick's fondness for speaking has been one of the major problems of Republican campaign managers this year, the paper writes. But he was arguably even more eccentric than his unconventional rhetoric made him sound, starting with the reason that he'd gone so long without cutting his hair. The Oklahoma Historical Society writes, rather astonishingly, largely self-educated, Herrick believed that he was Christ and became a preacher, although no church would accept him. The Herricks were so in awe of their son that they would walk several steps behind him. This self-belief that he was literally the Savior reborn is how he earned the title, the Okie Jesus. And if that wasn't strange enough, Ray Hill of the Knoxville Focus explains, when he was 17 years old, Manuel Herrick was arrested for attempting to rob a train in Oklahoma. A court of law adjudged him to be insane and promptly sent him to an asylum. That is, the Republican nominee in the 8th District in 1920 wasn't just a self-educated farmer who dressed and spoke oddly, and wasn't just a man who, Harlow's Weekly wrote, has made no success of his personal business, barely earning a living, and wasn't even known only for bizarre prolonged arguments in court with his neighbors. He literally thought himself to be the Son of God, and he had been legally committed as insane after robbing a train. And just in case people were confused as to his eccentricity, shortly before the primary election, Herrick went missing, only to show up in Wichita, Kansas, where he had been arrested. The Kansas City Post explained that he had showed up at the Wichita employment office seeking 3 days' work, and had become so agitated when told that there could not be a 3-day job, that he had been arrested for breach of the peace. He told the paper that he was trying to conceal himself from acquaintances until after the election because they bother me so much. He complained that people were trying to induce him to quit the race, going so far as to offer him $50,000. He was released to friends, but continued his campaign. Certainly voters had their doubts. The Oklahoman notes that even running unopposed, Herrick received only 7,216 votes in the August primary out of some 14,000 Republican votes cast. Nearly half the voters, apparently, chose to leave the congressional space blank rather than vote for Herrick. Simultaneously, another special election was being held to fill the remainder of Morgan's term from November to March. And as that had come later, that race allowed other Republicans to file. Running in that field against presumably many who would have run for the next term had they known that Morgan was not going to fill his seat, Herrick came in 5th. Where Herrick is well known, the Oklahoman writes, few could be found to admit that they expected to vote for him. But his candidacy was not as feeble as it sounds. For one, he had changed his appearance, cutting his long hair and biblical beard. The Oklahoman writes, Herrick at present, however, is smooth-shaven and goes so far in the way of town dress as to wear a coat and trousers that match, and a necktie. The rumor at Perry is that the new clothes were presented to him within the last few weeks by Republican friends. The Oklahoman worried that many Republican voters in the district were unfamiliar with Herrick and planned simply to vote a party ticket. Moreover, there was a scandal in the Democratic ticket. While the lackluster ticket filler C.H. Hyde had been the only Democrat on the ballot at the time of the filing deadline, a more palatable candidate, Zach A. Harris of Blackwell, had managed to have his name added, winning the nomination. Secretary McAllister told the Oklahoman that Harris had given me a signed application to be placed on the ticket as a candidate, but had told me to hold it until he should notify me whether to file it officially or not. On the day before the filing period closed, Harris told me by telephone not to file him as a candidate. A friend of Harris called the next day to tell him to file, but McAllister didn't take the friend's word as authoritative and did not file the papers. After Morgan died, however, Harris sued to be placed on the ballot, winning the argument in the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Republicans, who had been denied their own attempt to place a more credible candidate on the ballot, saw the decision as playing favorites and cried foul. In any case, the Oklahoman noted, it would be difficult for Harris to win in the heavily Republican district, made even more difficult by the addition of the female vote, which seemed to lean Republican. For his part, Herrick answered the charges of eccentricity in his own way, writing, My enemies have spread the report that I am an eccentric, until some of my friends believes it. Now I wish to say to the public that in a way it is true. I am an eccentric because I believe in the single standard of morality, and a great many men don't. I am now appealing to the Christian men and women to stand by the man who had the courage to fight for moral reform when the same was exceedingly unpopular. And demonstrating that Mr. Herrick was not entirely ignorant of the game of politics, he finished by referencing the scandal over placing Harris on the ballot, saying, I wish to remind the electorate that I did not burgle the election board and break in on the ticket by mandamus proceedings, like my Democrat opponent did. The election was held November 2nd, and turned out to be a rout for Republicans. Harding won easily, and Republicans picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives, securing more than 90% of the seats outside the solidly Democratic South. It was the largest Republican majority of the 20th century, and the greatest number of Republican seats in the House to this day. In Oklahoma's 8th Congressional District, the Clinton-Oklahoma Custer County Chronicle reported, the long term goes to the eccentric Manuel Herrick of Perry, the unusual nominee who beat Zach Harris decisively in spite of Herrick's evident unfitness for national office. In Congress, Herrick did not disappoint. The Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger wrote of him, eccentricity is not a crime in Congress. It's something of an asset to some men. There are men who wear their hair long about the ears. There are members who bring their lunch. There are millionaires and paupers and slim men and fat men, tall men and short men, bald men, men who shout, men who whisper, and men who chew tobacco. Men who flirt with the galleries, noisy men, gumshoers, scholars, statesmen, demagogues, all kinds of men in Congress, and many of them eccentric. But Herrick surpasses them all for sheer eccentricity, for capacity to do things differently and do different things. Herrick is unapproached. Described as one of the best storytellers in Congress, he once shut up another congressman whom he thought was taking too much credit by saying, I just been wondering if the case of the gentleman ain't parallel to the case of the flea that sat on the axle of the wagon and said, Oh, what a devil of a dust I'm a-raisin'. He was best known, however, for a bizarre scandal in which he had written amorous letters to 54 beauty pageant winners, establishing a sort of contest to marry him. He later claimed that it was all part of a plan to demonstrate the need for a bill he sponsored to ban beauty pageants. Another time, he secured a ride on an Army airplane circling the Capitol, billing himself as the world's greatest aerial stunt-flying congressman. Despite his antics, however, the Encyclopedia of Oklahoma History and Culture writes, Herrick generally heeded the Republican Party line, and although he worked diligently for his constituents, his good work was overshadowed by his eccentricities and by his lack of knowledge of the governmental process. True to form, Herrick flew his own airplane to campaign stops in his 1922 re-election bid. And after one crash, Kelly wrote in the Washington Post, he quipped, I may be a nut, but I'm going to be a hard one to crack. Herrick failed to secure the Republican nomination in 1922. and continued to fail, running unsuccessfully in 1924, 1926, 1928, and 1930. Herrick continued to make the news from time to time. In 1930, he was sentenced to 6 months in jail when he was caught operating a still in Connecticut, which was sort of odd for someone who had run as a moral reformer. In 1933, he moved to California, where in 1948 he once again ran for Congress, again unsuccessfully. And in February 1952, one of the oddest ducks ever to paddle in the Capitol's pond managed one last stunt. While walking to a mining claim that he owned in the Sierra Nevada mountains, he disappeared during a snowstorm. His body was found 3 weeks later in a snowdrift just 2 miles away from a cabin that he owned. He was 78 years old. The Okie Jesus Congressman had managed to make the news one last time. Kelly concluded, "Sometimes I wonder if people today live as interesting lives as people did 100 years ago." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.